Whether you're looking for answers to specific life questions or simply hoping to become the best version of you possible, welcome to the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast, where we offer insight, information, and strategies based upon research and years of practice as psychologists. So sit back, have a listen, and get connected with our hosts, Dr. Berney Wilkinson and Dr. Richard Marshall.
Welcome back. Richard, this week we are going to talk about alternative treatments to ADHD. And I think this is a really important and timely topic because, ADHD is still one of the most commonly diagnosed mental health conditions in children. Depending on where you live, anywhere from 8 to 15% or so of the population supposedly meets criteria for ADHD. It varies by region a little bit.
And it's interesting that some areas of the country have higher rates than other areas of the country, which mean that as most of these clinical diagnoses go, it's not subjective, but it is open to interpretation. And if a particular geographic region has higher expectations of children, and they don't perform up to a certain level, one of the reasons might be that a child has ADHD.
Right.
And so in some areas of the country where the expectations for behavior are higher, where children are to be seen and not heard, the ADHD rates of ADHD tend to be a little bit higher.
Yeah.
Interesting epidemiological stuff.
Absolutely. So while it's one of the more common diagnoses, the primary treatment, the initial treatment, tends to be medication.
Still is medication.
Especially the stimulant medications like Ritalin and Adderall.
And regardless of how this issue has been studied, and those, people talk about the medications, but these medications have been around since 1938.
Yeah.
And we've been using them now for 80, 70 years. And it is still the first line of treatment and the most effective treatment for this disorder. So before you just reject it out of hand, please know that based on all the research that's been done for a 70-year period, medication or a combination of medication and other treatments still remains the treatment of choice.
Right. And so that said, the important thing to also consider or to think about or to just keep in your mind is that, as we said, the prevalence of ADHD varies by region. One would think that the true nature of ADHD would be pretty consistent around. And so because of that variability, we have to assume that some of that increased diagnoses in certain regions is primarily because, as you said a moment ago, the expectations that we're putting on kids. If you take a second grader and you expect him to sit in a college classroom, for example, going to look very ADHD.
As we would. If we sat in a classroom and had no idea what was going on, we'd probably start to fidget. I certainly would start to fidget. Or I'd go to sleep.
Yeah. Well, that's true.
I'd probably go to sleep.
But so we have some circumstances, I guess you could say, where people meet or are diagnosed with ADHD, even though the true nature of those symptoms are probably associated more with the environment. And so a lot of times what parents will do is they'll ask for treatment for ADHD or for the ADHD symptoms outside of medication. Can we have some alternative to medication? Because, if my child has these ADHD symptoms, but it's because of the classroom or because of the nature of the expectations, and not because they have a true biological ADHD, what else can we do besides medication?
That's right. It's a very important point to make that it may just be. There are two expectations. Some are geographic. I think there are some areas of the country where children are expected to act in a way that may not be age appropriate. But also, as we move the curriculum down, we've talked about that many times, that we're asking kindergarten students to do what we used to ask first graders to do. And when you push the curriculum down that way, you have unrealistic and expectations that are no longer age appropriate.
Right.
So for kids who can't do them, they get accused of having an attentional problem. It may not be an attentional problem, it may be a maturation problem.
Right. We talked about this the other week. I think it was on the 9th of this month. We talked about the criticisms of self-regulation and the idea that maybe we're expecting too much of kids, and that's why their self-regulation skills don't quite match up to what they're expected. So it's the same thing with ADHD. Perhaps we are expecting too much of them, which is resulting in these ADHD symptoms.
Right. Correct.
So here we are with this phenomenon of people being diagnosed with ADHD. Sometimes whether they really have ADHD or not, they're just presenting with a cluster of symptoms that really everybody agrees on. The teachers agree that they have ADHD symptoms. The parents agree that they have ADHD symptoms, but we're not completely sure that they have those symptoms, and it's not just a response to the environment. So we have to think about alternative treatments.
Right.
So each day this week, we're going to talk about a different alternative treatment. And today we're going to talk about neurofeedback.
And I'm glad we're starting with neurofeedback.
Yeah.
Confusing issue. I remember when this first came out, it was back in the 80s. And there was a fellow at the University of Tennessee doing this kind of research and was getting phenomenal results. Not only was he reducing the symptoms of ADHD, but he claimed that the gains were permanent, which seemed counterintuitive to all of us at the time. And many other labs tried to replicate his work and were unable to do so. So for a time, it was thought that he wasn't being honest about his data. Since then, this was, I think, in 1983, since then, we have replicated some of his studies, and indeed, neurofeedback seems to work. I don't think the final decision has been made yet because there are some complexities that we'll discuss, but neurofeedback looks like a promising treatment for ADHD. Non-medical treatment for ADHD.
Not non-medication.
Non-medication.
It's still medical, grossly speaking. So here's, sort of in a nutshell, what neurofeedback is. What we do with neurofeedback is we take the a cap. There's a variety of ways to do it, but basically, the patient will wear something on their head.
It's an elastic cap. That so it fits snugly against your scalp.
It looks like something you would do for an EEG, with the wires coming out and everything. But there are others that have, sort of different types of headpieces and headsets that you would wear. But the idea is that you wear this on your head, and the wires go to the computer to measure electrical activity in the brain.
That's right. The nice thing, the convenient thing about the human brain is that it produces 4 very characteristic wave patterns. And they're like all electrical patterns. It's based on cycles per second. Like the electricity in a room is 60 cycles per second that travels at that speed. But the brain produces 4 characteristic wave patterns. When you're asleep, that's called delta, and it's a very slow 1.5 to 4 cycles per second of electrical activity. So all humans produce delta wave activity when we're asleep. Well, what we want with ADHD, what we think is happening is that the person isn't producing enough rapid brain activity. And so what you do is you treat it like a muscle. You exercise it until you increase it. This is what Thatcher said was a permanent increase. Don't know that yet. So we have these 4 characteristic brainwave patterns.
And the name of the 4 aren't very informative. It's just alpha, beta, delta, theta. Why not? We'll just use Greek letters too.
I don't know why. I guess don't know why.
There's so many other ways.
But the slowest is delta.
Them.
Okay, and the second is.
The second what?
Second is theta. Okay, and theta is 5 to 8 cycles per second, and then alpha, which is 9 to 14. And then our target is beta, which is the fastest, and what beta is 15 to 40 cycles per second. So these are very regular patterns. You wouldn't think of the brain because it's such a mess of electrical activity. You wouldn't think of it producing these 4 very characteristic, hardwired electrical, and that's what's being measured by the cap. You can measure this activity coming off the brain. And what you want to do is you want to get the brain up to beta. Okay? Because when you're in beta activity is when you're engaged. So right now, our brains are completely engaged. So Dr. B and I are probably producing beta. Okay? Because we're completely engaged in this topic, we're talking, and the brain is really engaged. If I would turn everything over to him and just sit here, I would go from beta to delta.
Or
beta
alpha.
to alpha, and then to theta, and I could eventually just fall asleep. Okay, because the less engaged you are, the slower the brainwaves are. Okay?
And so that's why, like in the evening when you're trying to go to sleep, you want to, decrease sensory input, with a dark room, cold, very
That's really
sensory.
That's a good point.
Right.
Yeah, because when you think of children, when they're running around playing video games and running around the house and taking a bath, that's beta activity. You want to get them all the way to delta.
Yeah.
And so you have to gradually reduce that, because they're not going to go to sleep if they're in beta.
Right.
Okay, so you have to gradually reduce it to delta.
Right. So we do this. So we have the cap, and we are measuring those electrical, the electrical output, and the patient will be usually watching something on a screen. Sometimes it's a movie. Sometimes it's something specific that they're interacting with. There's some games out there where you're interacting with things with the goal of producing or controlling at least your brain activity by monitoring what's happening on the screen. So, for example, there may be a movie playing on the screen, and if your brain activity starts to drop, the image on the screen will start to fade.
Starts to degrade.
And so you have to reorient and bring your attention back to the screen, and then it will light back up again.
Because the screen only works if you're giving it beta waveforms. Okay, that's an engineering issue. Okay, you don't need to worry about that. But you have to produce beta to keep the movie running. Anything less than that, anything slower than beta, the movie begins to. You're not giving it enough energy. Okay, so what it does is it forces the individual to learn how hard you have to concentrate to create beta. And that's what everybody says. Wow, I didn't realize it was this hard to produce beta activity.
And there's some other games, other sort of popular activity headsets and things like that you can get. We have some of them here at the office that you can use to play games, even where you have to focus and you have to put that intent out there to make things happen and move on the screen and everything, and it's very engaging, and it is very hard to do.
It's really hard. I mean, you'd be surprised how hard you have to concentrate.
And so, and especially for people with ADHD, because when you think about that classic traditional person with ADHD who has a difficult time sitting and concentrating while they're reading or something like that, and so that person may have earbuds in, listening to music, and they're watching something on TV all while they're trying to do their homework. There has to be that much stimulation to get their brain activity up to the level that it needs to be, so that they can focus on their work. It is counterintuitive, I think, to what most people think when it comes to ADHD. I think many people think that the brain is overstimulated in those conditions, but they're not. It's understimulated, and that's why we use stimulant medications. But here with neurofeedback, and the reason we call it neurofeedback is because, well, the neuro part is obvious, I think, but the feedback is that you're getting the feedback from the instrument that you're using, so that you can make adjustments and you can alter the way that you're thinking. There's nothing applied to the body to make that happen. It's just the feedback that you're getting from the technology itself for you to put forth the effort to attend.
Yeah, the movie's telling you whether you're producing enough activity or not. So that's the feedback. The movie is telling you.
Now, to me, it is fascinating. There are some critics. To neurofeedback, and I think it's important that we recognize that it hasn't been completely it hasn't been proven
Right.
that it has, as you said, sort of this long-term effectiveness. There are people who certainly say that it does, and there are patients who have certainly said that it's effective.
That's right. And I think what you have to remember is that just as we have 25% non-responders to stimulant medication, which means they probably don't have ADHD.
Right.
So you're going to have the same number of non-responders, at least that many non-responders to this, because that's really not the problem.
Right.
Okay?
Right. Yeah. It's if it's really not a brain-based attentional problem, it's going to be less likely that it's going to be effective, because then there's some other factors that are involved, whether it's motivation, emotions, interest, those kinds of things.
That's right. And
yeah. But another major limitation, major criticism is the expense. It's an expensive.
it's still the technology is expensive. The hardware and software is expensive.
Right. Yeah. The materials themselves are tens of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very expensive for a provider to have those kinds of tools. But then it's expensive for the patient, because you have, the course of a treatment may be about 20 sessions or so.
Right.
So once a week for about 20 weeks, which is a commitment.
Right.
Each session.
Yeah, it's a time commitment. It's half of some. Yeah.
Each session lasts 30 minutes to an hour or so, with all that they have to do. And this, depending on where you're going, the cost is anywhere from $2,000 to $5,000 for the 20 sessions. So it's an expensive proposition. But again,
if you get permanent results,
right?
Let's say you're able to do this, and you respond, whether you're a child or an adult, and you respond to the treatment. That's you're going to spend that much for medication copays, unless your copay is $7 or $8.
Well, medication and the monthly or bi-monthly visits to the doctor and those kinds of things.
So it's really not more expensive, and it probably the 20 sessions will be sufficient. Sometimes individuals go in and get an extra tune-up every once in a while. I know there are college students who go in and get a tune-up just before finals.
Right.
They go in for a couple of sessions just to get their brain back working exactly the way they want it. So, but I think the cost is probably fairly reasonable. I don't know whether insurance companies.
That's a big question.
Some are going to consider it experimental until there's a little bit more research done. But I think it would be well worth it if you had a reduction of symptoms or an elimination of symptoms. Then it looks inexpensive because you're avoiding a host of other problems.
Right. And I think it's very likely that insurance companies that may not cover it right now are going to soon, because we're already getting some FDA approved treatment, non-medication treatments for different things through apps and other technologies. But I think that the most promising, the thing that I like the most about neurofeedback, and really all the things that we're going to talk about this week, is that unlike medication makes you available.
Right.
Okay? It makes your brain available to learn and available for the information. What neurofeedback and some of the other things that we're going to talk about this week do is they actually teach skills. And that, I think, is the massive difference that people really have to consider. If you're able to, if you're able to learn how to focus, if you're able to learn how to train your brain to focus and to attend and to, muster the energy needed to perform a particular task, that is far better than relying on a medication.
Medication is passive.
Right.
Okay. You take medication and it changes you.
And let's be honest, that's what a lot of people want.
Right.
A lot of people, and this isn't being critical, it's just being honest. A lot of people want that easy path.
Right.
Because they feel like they don't have the time or the energy or the money or commitment or whatever it is to be able to learn those strategies. And so medication is an easy path in those situations. I mean, it's the same thing with type 2 diabetes.
It's all the same.
Type 2 diabetes, again, let's be honest, is preventable. It's preventable.
And reversible.
Right. For the most, so it's it requires work, absolutely, but we just have to be willing to do that work.
Right. We said at the beginning that the best treatment is a combination of medication and other treatments.
Right.
So this would be the other treatment.
Right.
And you're learning a skill.
Right.
You're giving yourself some control of this rather than relying passively relying on a medication.
Right. Absolutely.
So we're not saying don't use medication, but this is a great adjunct.
Right.
To medication.
Absolutely.
Because it teaches you a skill. And you watch children, they get fascinated by this and they say, wow, I can do this myself.
Yeah.
And it's a huge breakthrough for them because prior to this, they were affected by a disorder that they didn't understand, and they took a pill that they didn't understand.
Right.
So this gives them some control, and that's what we want.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, all right. Well, that is it for today. We got more that we're going to talk about over the course of the week. So come back and learn a little bit more about meditation and diet and nutritional supplements.
We're going to talk about all those things. So
and Friday we're going to talk about nature.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting
that was fascinating
perspective. So, all right, until next time, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid. Thanks for sharing this episode of the Mental Breakdown and Psychreg podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to follow us on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find all of our previous podcasts and much more. We would be honored if you would become a patron through patreon.com, where any donation you can manage will go to the development and creation of more content. Just visit patreon.com/thementalbreakdown for more information. Thanks again for listening. Have an awesome day, and we look forward to being back in your feed tomorrow morning.